It's Lindsay Smith Rogers, producer of Public Health on Call. As 2025 winds down, we want to say thank you for listening, contributing, and sticking with us through another year of massive change and breakthroughs in public health. This season, we've explored how uncertainty can also mean opportunity and how science, policy, and community continue to shape the world we live in. We've also launched a brand new Instagram account at Public Health Pod, where you'll find highlights, quotes, and behind-the-scenes moments, as well as ways to tell us about what topics you want to hear next. You can also send us your questions and voice memos anytime at publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. We're taking a short break for the holidays, and then we'll be back on January 5th with season 13 of the show. Until then, thank you for being part of this growing community. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you in the new year. And now, on to today's episode.
Welcome to Public Health on Call, a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where we bring evidence, experience, and perspective to make sense of today's leading health challenges. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes.
Hey listeners, it's Lindsay Smith Rogers. Today, alternatives to animal testing. For years, products like cosmetics and medicine have used animal testing to adhere to strict regulatory safety standards prior to human use. But new technology could be used to test products more efficiently, thoroughly, and importantly, ethically. Paul Locke, a lawyer and scientist who runs a policy lab at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, talks with me about the current state of this technology, the policy and research gaps, and what it would really take to move away from animal testing altogether. Let's listen. Paul Locke, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call. How are you doing today?
I'm great, and thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you, and I really appreciate the opportunity that this Public Health on Call podcast brings.
We're really excited to talk to you. Today, we're talking about alternatives to animal testing. And to start off, would you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into this work?
Sure. So my background is I am both a lawyer and a scientist. I practiced law for a couple of decades before I went back to school and got my doctoral degree in environmental health sciences. And my public health training at Johns Hopkins is in environmental health. So I took a lot of courses in toxicology, epidemiology, things like that. And I try to combine those backgrounds in our work.
Can you just give us sort of a lay of the land of where animal testing is these days?
Before I start that, if I could, I just want to make two quick points. Top line here, why this work is so exciting to us and we think so important to public health is that it's a double win. The first part of the win is it saves animal lives, and animals are sentient creatures, so we hopefully will be using fewer and fewer of them. But the second part is these new technologies we're going to talk about are actually technologies we think can do a better job of predicting human response to chemicals, to radiation, to other things in the environment. So we're going to be making better decisions if we use these new models. So let me now get to your question. Maybe the best way to think about this is to dial back about 100 years, put on, as we say in the law, your powdered wig. Recognize that back in the bad old days, there was no way to protect humans from things that were put on the market. So very often what you had were companies and entrepreneurs directly experimenting on humans without knowing what the effects were going to be. And this has actually led to some real horrific incidents in our history. So this is back in the 20s, 30s, 40s of the 20th century. The other thing that, of course, colors all this is the experimentation on humans that was illegal and horrible that took place in the 1940s and 1950s. The main message I want to get across is this really led us to say, okay, what models can we use that will be predictive of human response? So animal models started and developed from there.
And what kinds of industries is this used for?
Wow, it's used across public health. So, for example, if you are trying to develop anything for the market, a cosmetic, a drug, testing for environmental chemicals to see how they would perhaps affect not only humans but other creatures in the environment.
How accurate is it to test something on an animal and then predict how a human might experience that?
Yeah, that is the key question. And so I'm going to give you an answer that's not a very good answer, but I think we'll be able to explore it a little more. And that answer is, it depends. The way I think about this is that animal models have served us well in the past. We've been able to develop life-saving and life-changing drugs from them. We've been able to predict the effect of chemicals in the environment using them. But in my opinion, we are beginning to bump up against the limits of animal models. And there are many reasons for that. One of the major reasons is, simply put, animal physiology is not human physiology. Animal biology is not human biology. So that's why my group is working so hard to get us on a transition plan to move away from animal models to more human-centric models.
Great. So let's talk about what some of these alternatives are. What does the technology look like?
I'm going to divide up those technologies into three groups. The first group is the use of machine learning or artificial intelligence applying to data sets we already have to explore those data sets in a more robust way. So if you think about it, our computing power has increased so much over the past, let's say, 5-10 years. We're able to go back and use some of this historical data to think about things differently to make better predictions. That's way number one. Way number two is the development of these things we call organoids. Now, organoids are not human organs, but what they are groups of cells from human organs that when you put them together and you give them the right conditions, they self-organize into something that looks like an organ, and they are close enough so that you can use them to explore biological information. So, for example, if you had a brain organoid, you could test the brain organoid using different chemicals to see how the brain organoid would respond to that. Same thing with a liver organoid. And they're also small, so one thing I should point out with these organoids is you can do what's known as high throughput. So instead of testing on, one animal or 5 animals, you can use a 96 well plate to test. So that gives you more power. The third area are these things we call organs on a chip. And what they are is exactly what they sound like. You take an engineered structure and you develop something that mimics the features of the organ. So for example, if you had a lung on a chip, that lung on a chip would actually do exchange of air. You would have fluid flowing through it as blood flows through the lung, and you could test chemicals and other things on that. Those are the three major areas. There are different descriptions that you'll find in the literature. However, I think those three cover the field pretty well.
So tell us about the work that your policy lab is doing.
Yes, thank you. So we really focus on what happens to the science when it escapes from the journals and escapes from the labs, the wet labs, and gets in the hands of policymakers. So what are we thinking about? We're thinking about how you make a transition from using animal models to using these new, exciting, human-inspired biological models, and what you need to do in terms of your policies, regulations, and laws to create a world where those models can be developed and used effectively for regulatory decision-making, for clinical decision-making. Now, we are moving in that direction, but one of the key things that we do in our policy lab is we think about innovative ways to accelerate that change so that instead of it happening sort of in an unguided fashion, we identify the areas where changes really need to be made and suggest through literature, by working with federal and state officials, what needs to take place.
Can you give us an example of this? I mean, it sounds like if we're gonna use, for example, a computational power. So I'm assuming this is like, in the past, we've done these experiments with these animals using these different compounds. We can take that data, and rather than running those experiments again, we have a new product that has a similar compound. We can just use that same old data, but maybe that's not what the requirement is for safety testing or something like that. Is that an example of like how the policy needs to change?
Yes, and I think you put your finger on something that's very important, which is there are many laws and regulations that cover this field. So we talk about the term safety, but safety means something different under different federal laws, for example. So you need to have a recognition that your science has to match what the regulators want. Now, that being said, let me give you an example of some of the things that we think about. The first thing we think about is most obviously funding. We have funding agencies, public health agencies that give funding out on a competitive basis, like the National Institutes of Health. We are trying to push them to do more funding around non-animal models, these human-inspired models. Now, fortunately for our work, the current Trump administration has gotten on board in several ways. They have issued several policies that really focus on trying to do this. I think it's a little frustrating to us because they have not yet really done the hard work of changing the laws and regulations that need to be changed, but they have been more willing to think about how to use these new models. A simple question that we can all ask ourselves is, how much NIH funding really should be dedicated to these new models? Should it be 1%? Should it be 10%? Should it be more? And that's something our group tries to highlight, and we try to focus on what that would look like. Let me give you one other example. So the funding is sort of at the front end of things, if you will. At the back end of things, there's something called validation. And that simply means, how are we going to know that these models are reliable and relevant? And how you know that is both a legal and scientific question. So the science has to meet the legal standards, and how that all has to happen is something that we feel requires a lot more thought, and we're working hard to do that. So we want federal agencies to really have a validation system that is robust, protects people, but is understandable. Because in this country, what do we want to do? We want to unleash innovation. The only way we're going to do that is to create a clear pipeline as to what that needs to look like. So that last step, that validation step, is really important. You don't want to produce something that's not going to be accepted regulatorily, because to produce it takes years and years and years and costs tens of millions of dollars. So those are two examples of what we're thinking about. We're working on a whole bunch of other projects. Maybe this is a little bit of a shameless advertisement, but we have an active website. We have a tox blog that we put out every 2 weeks. And by the way, those are for people who don't like to read 30-page scientific articles. These are short 600 to 900 word snippets that give you, I think, a good flavor as to our work. And also we highlight the work of others in our field.
Now, you mentioned at the beginning that this was a win-win situation, one of the wins being no more testing on animals, and the other win being we could actually do this better. So where is the state of technology currently in doing this better, and how does that impact some of the work you're doing around uptake?
So the state of technology is kind of all over the place. There are some models that are quite good and are being used, although I would say in general, they're being used as supplements now, so sort of as checks to the animal models. There are some models in development that can be rolled out and have been rolled out to actually support, for example, the acceptance of certain drugs. But we are still pretty early on in that transition. A lot more work needs to be done. I think it can be done quickly and can be done well. I'd like to see us move quickly, because I think it would really, again, be a double win, improve human health, as well as save the lives of animals. I should also point out that just the money that laboratories have to spend in caring for animals is substantial. And that makes sense, because you want to treat these animals as well as you can. They have to be fed, they have to be housed, they have to have top veterinary care. Some of them have to have exercise. So we have to understand that that expense might be better transitioned to systems that don't require the need to keep living things healthy.
So this has been on the agenda for HHS Secretary Kennedy. He has talked about doing away with animal testing entirely. What would that entail? And I'm asking you that in particular because you've mentioned that NIH is a huge part of this, and all of this funding to go into this kind of technology. So what would the future look like? What would it take to have this really happen?
Yeah, that is one of the key questions. And I think one of the most important things to remember is we can't just flip a switch now and stop all animal testing and start with non-animal testing, these human-inspired alternatives. I wish we could. It would make my job much easier. But what we need to do is we need to create an off-ramp and a transition plan so we can move to this system. Now, I mentioned earlier that the administration has been active in this area, and I have to give them high marks for talking the talk. So they put policies in place. They've said that they want to do this. In some cases, they've actually gone out and used these alternatives. But in terms of walking the walk, they need to do a lot more. They need to dedicate the funding. They need to change their legal and policy and regulatory systems. And that hasn't happened yet. So while I know Secretary Kennedy is getting a lot lot of pressure to end animal testing now, that would not be the best way forward. Maybe a crude example is if you're at the top of a mountain, the easiest way down is a head dive. But that's not what we need to do here. We need to walk down this mountain. We need to be careful, and we need to do it right. And again, that gets back to the issue that I think many people don't focus on, and that is the issue of innovation. We have an amazingly innovative group of scientists and technology people in this country that will actually be able to create this system. It is going to take the right kind of policies, laws, and regulations, but it is eminently doable.
You started us off with a little look back in history with our powdered wigs, and you've been doing this work for a long time. Can you give us an idea of where we are in the process? How far away are we from this reality?
I wish I could. I think the answer is in some areas. In the area of cosmetics, for example, I don't think animals are used anymore for testing. But it's very dependent on what you're looking at and the purpose you're looking at it for. So I guess the most important message I would have is if we don't get on this road, we're never going to know what the end timing looks like. And my focus and the focus of our group has really been how you start down that road and what it's going to look like. I do believe that once we do that, things will accelerate very quickly.
Well, Professor Locke, thank you so much for joining us on Public Health on Call and talking about this. We're really excited to see what happens next.
Thanks again for having me, and I look forward to working with anyone who would like to get involved with these issues and hope they will reach out to my group because we really are trying to enlist the public health community.
Public Health on Call is a podcast from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, produced by Joshua Sharfstein, Lindsay Smith Rogers, and Stephanie Desmond. Audio production by J.B. Arbogast, Michael Bonfils, Spencer Greer, Matthew Martin, and Philip Porter, with support from Chip Hickey. Distribution by Nick Moran. Production coordination by Catherine Ricardo. Analytics by Elisa Rosen. If you have questions or ideas for us, please send an email to publichealthquestion@jhu.edu. That's publichealthquestion@jhu.edu for future podcast episodes. Thank you for listening.